Hi, and welcome to Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. In this lecture, I'm continuing on in my series on plant form and function. What we're going to talk about today is plant tissues. Wait, plants have tissues? Yeah, they do. They also have organs, and they have differentiated cells. I know, that sounds kind of like an animal, doesn't it? We have differentiated cells that form tissues that form organs. That is because plants, like you and me, are a multicellular organism, full-fledged multicellular organism. So my goal today is to talk about the different types of plant tissues and how that leads into plant growth, because plants also have meristematic cells, which are like stem cells that differentiate into the different types of cells that form the tissues that form the organs of the plant. But before I get started, let's talk a little bit about plant cells. I know. Now, if you've taken some intro biology class in high school or even in college, there was probably a test where you had a plant cell and an animal cell, and it said, tell me the differences between plant and animal cells. But before I do that, I just have to say that there is a remarkable amount of similarity between plants and animal cells. I know, that's weird. Like, we're always taught the differences. But think about it this way. We are both eukaryotic cells. I mean, our origin dates back over 2 billion years ago to the primary endosymbiosis. You know, when some aerobically respiring bacteria started living inside of another prokaryote, probably some type of archaean. And that bacteria evolved into the mitochondria that produces lots of ATP for these cells. And eventually, we got eukaryotic cells, these larger, more complex cells that have a cell nucleus, organelles, and a cytoskeleton made up of actin fibers, microtubules, and keratin fibers, or intermediate filaments. So here we are with plant cells. Plant cells are eukaryotic cells. They have mitochondria. They reproduce asexually by mitosis. No, wait, I said they have mitochondria? Yeah, they need oxygen, just like you and I do. They do cellular respiration. Now, fortunately, during the daytime, plants produce a lot of oxygen through photosynthesis. But hey, did you know at night, plants are sucking down the oxygen? Just not very much of it because, well, they don't have a very active lifestyle like we do. Now, that being said, there are differences between plant and animal cells. Now, one of them is they have what is called plastids. And there's chloroplasts, amyloplasts, and tonoplasts. Now, these other types of plastids like amyloplasts, they're small organelles and they store starch that can actually detect gravity. I know plants can detect gravity. That's why roots typically grow down and shoots grow up. They know which way is up or down. And they've also got tanoplasts that store tannins and polyphenols, which are chemicals produced by plants. And of course, the most famous and important of all of these plastids are the chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. And when I get to photosynthesis in this series of lectures, I will go into detail about the structure of the chloroplast. And of course, plants are green, or at least the leaves are, because they have the green pigment called chlorophyll, which is of course found inside the chloroplast. Other differences. Animal cells lack a cell wall. Plant cells have a cell wall. Now, bacteria also have a cell wall as well, but it's made up of protein and sugars complex called a peptidoglycan. And plants, their cell wall is made up of a complex carbohydrate called cellulose. So it's a polymer of glucose. There I go again, using big words. You take a glucose molecule, stick them together, and you make cellulose. But you got to do it the correct way. Also inside of these cells is something called a vacuole. This is an organelle that stores water and minerals and other metabolites for the plant. Now, plant cells, adjacently, they have a structure called a plasmodesmata. What this is a continuation of the cellular membrane goes through the cell wall. And that allows the cytoplasm between adjacent cells to mix. That way water can get through, minerals can get through, and chemical signals can get through. Yeah, Plants are multicellular organisms. They send out chemical signaling. They can send it to adjacent cells. They can also send it long distance through hormones. I know. Wow. Okay. So we have these cells. Cells and plants differentiate, and they can form different tissues. A simple tissue is made up of a single type of cell, and a complex tissue is made up of many different types of cells. So plants have these tissue systems, and there are three primary types of tissue systems in plants. You have the dermal tissue, dermal, like think skin, like the outside. You've got the ground tissue, which forms things like your inner part of the leaves where a lot of photosynthesis takes place, and storage. So think of a potato, right? That's got a lot of ground tissue storing carbohydrates for later. And then you have the vascular system. And the vascular system will consist of the xylem and the phloem that conducts water, minerals, sugars, and other metabolites. Now, all of these tissue systems, they derive from what is called meristematic tissue or meristematic cells. These are your stem cells. These cells are undifferentiated. And as a plant grows, these stem cells will divide. These meristematic cells will divide. And then the cells, depending on the signals they get and their location, will then differentiate into these different types of tissue systems and ultimately to unique types of cells, forming those tissue systems. And don't forget, the tissue systems come together to form the organs like a leaf. So here it is. You have what is called the apical meristem. Now remember, meristematic cells, these are your stem cells in plants. They divide and then they can differentiate. They can turn into other types of cells. Apical, apex, means they're at the tip of either a stem or a root. And as they divide, they will differentiate into three different types of primary meristems. The protoderm, which will then differentiate into different types of dermal tissue and dermal cells. The ground meristem, which will then differentiate into your ground tissue. These are a lot of the cells that do photosynthesis for us, or storage. And then the procambium, which will then differentiate into the vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, both primary and secondary. When we talk about plant growth, that'll become a bit more clear what that means. So let's start. Let's begin with the protoderm. Proto just means before, derm means like your skin layer, right? So the outside of the cell. So the protoderm gives rise to various different types of dermal tissue. So when plants were evolving hundreds of millions of years ago to live on land, one of the things they had to overcome was water loss. We also call that desiccation. So plants evolved what is called a cuticle. This is a layer over the outside of the plant, and it's a waxy coating, and it prevents water loss. On the underside of many types of leaves are these little openings called the stomata. And these are very, very important because water has to move, be absorbed from the roots, move up through the stem, and it goes out the leaves. And you have to have this continuous movement of water, more or less continuous, but it has to keep moving through the plant. Well, if you've got a cuticle on the outside of the leaf to prevent water loss, on the underside, you have these stomata. And they're surrounded by two guard cells that can open and close. And in addition to letting water out of the leaf, to keep water moving through, it also is a site of gas exchange. Oxygen leaves, carbon dioxide comes in. And then the guard cells, like I said, they can open and close in response to water loss. Guess what? We're going to talk at length about how these stomata can open and close, the guard cells. It's really cool how they do that. They have some chemical signals coming up from the roots that, yeah, it's fun. We'll get to it. Other types of dermal tissue. We've got the cuticle, we've got the stomata. We also have these things called trichomes. Trichomes are small growths that can be of very different types. They can keep the plant cool. They can prevent water loss by changing the microclimate around the leaf. They can prevent herbivory because they can have all kinds of chemicals in them that are not good for insects or make it taste bad for large mammals. And some of you might be familiar with some types of trichomes on special plants here that people like to enjoy. The trichomes have what is called a secondary metabolite called cannabidiol. Cannabidiols are a class of chemicals that we're just now starting to study. And we're realizing that these cannabidiols might actually have medicinal properties in addition to that getting high, like the THC, tetrahydrocannabinol causes. But we're realizing that these things might help prevent epilepsy. They might be used against depression. They might be used to treat anxiety. They might be able to treat nauseousness. So finally, as we have started to relax our laws against marijuana, we can now begin to study the chemicals in these plants for their medicinal uses. And we can also begin to understand the effects that long-term and habitual use have on our brains as well. You need information. Remember when I talked about carnivorous plants? I know, carnivorous plants. Plants that eat insects. They can even eat small mammals sometimes. Well, there's one in particular called a sundew plant. And what the sundew plant has are these trichomes that are loaded with like a sticky material. It's a bunch of carbs. And basically, an insect lands on these things thinking it's going to get an easy meal. It's so sticky, they get stuck to it. They can't fly off. The plant then wraps around it and digests it. Nature is so brutal. Other types of dermal tissue, when you're not trying to catch insects, are root hairs. Your roots have these tiny little hairs coming off of the epidermis, and they are there to increase surface area so the plant can absorb more water. Okay, so that is the protoderm that differentiates into all these different parts of the outside of the plant, both on the leaves, the stems, and the roots. Now let's move to the ground meristem. Now the ground meristem produces the ground tissue. This is where we do photosynthesis and storage most of the time. You know, with 280,000 species of plants, and one of the main rules in biology, there's always exceptions, but I probably won't get into those too much here. Okay, get ready for some words. Parenchyma, sclerenchyma, collenchyma. These are three different types of tissues that come from the ground meristem, okay? And they each have different functioning. In addition to photosynthesis, storage, they're also used for support in the plant as well. Let's start with parenchyma cells. For one, they can be like totipotent stem cells. So my grandfather was quite a plant grower back in the day, and he used to grow lots of plants. And one thing he would do was whenever he found a plant he liked, he would go take cuttings off of it, cut the little branch off, stick it some soil, and water it. And then it would turn into a new plant. And it's because this parenchyma cells, which are totipotent stem cells, right? They would begin to divide and then differentiate, and the plant, the little cutting, would form roots, and it would grow into a whole new tree or bush. Pretty cool. Parenchyma cells in leaves form what is called a mesophyll cell. And a mesophyll cell are, when you look at a leaf, that's mostly what you're seeing. It's just underneath the epidermis. And this is where all the chloroplasts are like. So if you've ever seen a leaf under a microscope and you're looking at all the little chloroplasts inside that leaf, you are looking at the mesophyll cells, which is a type of parenchyma cell. Now roots. You get down into the roots and they can actually store water. You can form tubers like a sweet potato, and those are parenchyma cells as well. Now the other one is a collenchyma cell. Have you ever eaten celery? It's all stringy. Yeah, those strings are collenchyma cells, and they help support shoots in the plants. And they have these thicker cell walls, thicker than parenchyma cells. That's why you can eat spinach. You can eat celery too, but you notice there's a very different texture in there as well. And then you get to the sclerenchyma cells. You ever tried to crack a walnut? Pretty tough, isn't it? Or you've seen like wood, like a 2x4. Well, these are full of what's called sclerenchyma cells, and they help support plants. And they have these very thick secondary cell walls that make a plant very, very rigid. And a lot of times, plants with a lot of sclerenchyma cells, like like xylem cells, when you look at a 2x4, those are mostly dead cells and they're stiff. But they might be 90% of the cell's volume. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? Now let's talk about the Procambium, because somehow we have to connect the roots to the shoots, the leaves to the roots. So we have the Procambium that gives rise to the vascular tissue. Now, first of all, let's begin with the xylem. The xylem carries water and minerals from the roots up to the leaves, okay? And we have tracheids and vessel elements. Now, interestingly, these tracheids and vessel elements, when they're transporting water, they are not spending any energy. It's all passive. And when I start talking about water and sugar transport in plants, I will go into great detail about how water moves into the roots and gets to the leaves and how they don't spend any energy on it. And we'll talk about these different tracheids and vessel elements that we find in angiosperms. Conifers have tracheas, but angiosperms have tracheids and these vessel elements. Now, the leaves. Most of the time, this is where photosynthesis is occurring. So you've got to get those carbohydrates from the leaves down to the roots. And this is what the phloem does. And the phloem has what is called a sieve tube element and a companion cell. And this is active transport. So a plant cell uses energy to load up a phloem, and they're using the companion cells to do that. So companion cells are alive at maturity, whereas a lot of the xylem is actually dead. Interesting. Okay, now let's look at the root and stem organization. This is a eudicot. So we're talking about a flowering plant, an angiosperm. I know if we look at the broad divisions of plants, you've got your bryophytes, which are your non-vascular plants. You've got your ferns. Then you've got your seed plants, which include the gymnosperms, which are all your conifers. Think pine trees. And then you have your angiosperms. Think things that produce flowers. They also include trees and grasses as well. And then in your flowering plants, we broadly divide them into monocots and eudicots, the new dicots. And here in this eudicot, you can see that you've got the ground tissue in the middle, the epidermis is on the outside, and you can see the vascular bundles made up of both the xylem and the phloem. And typically xylem cells are slightly bigger than the phloem cells. Now a monocot is a bit different. Think grasses, think lilies, think irises, things that have parallel veins here. And you notice on the eudicot, the vascular bundles form a ring around the pith, around all that ground tissue. But you get to like a grass or a lily, something that's a monocot, you realize that the vascular bundles are scattered throughout the stem. And then the roots are different as well. Notice in the root of a eudicot, the one on the right, that there's almost this cross-like pattern. You've got your larger xylem cells in the middle, surrounded by your phloem cells on the outside, and they're both inside this endodermis. They form a little bitty ring in the center of the root. So of course that's ground tissue outside of that. Then in the monocot, you have a tiny little ring of the vascular bundles inside the endodermis. Endodermis means inside skin. There's actually a layer there. And the reason why they have that is so that the plant can easily load up water and minerals and send them up to the shoots, the leaves and the stems, and they can regulate what's getting into the vascular bundle. Once again, when I talk about water and sugar and mineral transport, I'll talk about the role of that endodermis and the pericycle and how it grows these different things and forms a barrier so that the plant can regulate what's coming in and out. Okay, so there's our overall plant body. You've got the roots anchoring the plant to the ground, absorbing all the minerals. It also has a vascular tissue, which is starting to transport the minerals up to the shoots and into the leaves. And then the leaves will, they're doing photosynthesis, and then they're going to send the metabolites back down to the roots through the phloem. So this leads into plant growth. And we have, of course, primary plant growth, which is where plants are elongating. And then we have secondary plant growth, where the plant is getting thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker. So think about like a tree growing, that secondary growth. And like I said, this comes from our meristems. Whether it's an apical meristem, found at the tip of the shoot, and we may also have a lateral meristem,